And colleagues and the eminent panelists, very warm welcome from me. With that excellent, I think the first plenary discussion on the barriers, I think we already have a solid head start in terms of really looking at what challenges we are facing in recovery. Moving on, we will now focus on looking at recovery preparedness. We had a great start, I would say, yesterday with the training on recovery preparedness, pre-disaster recovery planning. And today we have a very eminent panelist here with us who will further unpack the issue of preparedness in recovery. The main aim of this session, this panel discussion, is to essentially, as we did in the first one, is to learn from countries, listen to you and learn from your experience, identify what works, what did not work, and then enumerate some recommendations, suggestions that how do we move forward collectively. So with that, let me first welcome our panelists. To my left, Ms. Michelle Forbes, Director, National Emergency Management Organization, St. Vincent and Grenadines. Welcome. Then we have Mr. Mafua i-Vai'Utukakau Maka, Director, the Ministry of Environment, Information, Disaster Management, Energy and Climate Change from Tonga.
Aldi.
Then I have Ms. Melissa Pexton, Deputy Commissioner, Strategy and Emergency Management Command at the Department of Fire and Emergency Services, Western Australia. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
Then I have from Fiji, Ms. Vasiti Soko, Director of National Emergency Management Office from Fiji.
Bullock.
And I have Mr. Daniel Etim Obot from the National Emergency Management Agency, Nigeria.
Good morning, all.
So again, a warm welcome to all of you. So colleagues, as we heard in the first session, and our experience from decades really show that when it comes to recovery, and essentially post-disaster recovery, we always see the trend of getting into that urgent mode. And I think, and perhaps it's very natural and obvious, because after a disaster, when you are in a situation where you have to first and foremost save lives, that's perhaps the right thing to do, that you get into urgent mode. And when it comes to recovery, reconstruction, restoration, we still continue in that urgent mode. And when we are in urgent mode, it also forces us to make the same mistakes or recreate risk, and perhaps unknowingly, getting into that same cycle of response, risk, and creating further exposure and so on. Recovery preparedness, I think, is definitely significant. We all know, and to me, I would say it's a common sense approach, that in order to have an appropriate recovery, you have to prepare. You have to prepare well in advance. However, what we are seeing as well is that it's not necessarily happening. The midterm review analysis showed us that we're still far from it. It's easier said than done. Now we need to understand why it is. I mean, if it is common sense, if we know that, yes, we have to prepare, what are those barriers? What are those challenges? What are those bottlenecks to really make recovery preparedness a priority? I would, before I go into the session and ask my first question to the panelists, I think colleagues have already well established the housekeeping, which is we are using WebWorks, and those who are in the room, they can raise their hand at the end for questions, and we have online participants who can ask their questions through the WebWorks. So without any further delay, let me ask the same question which my colleague Simonetta asked to all the panelists. In a minute, if you can tell us, what does resilient recovery mean to you and your country? So if I may start with my panelist on the left, Michelle.
Thank you, and good morning again to everyone. As a small island state, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, resilient recovery to us is to ensure that the repeated risk and hazards that we face has less and less impact on our people. Vulnerability is reduced and economic losses are reduced. To achieve this, though, we must have a methodology to ensure that these assessments that really drive our response and our recovery are carried out and implemented without bias, improve or have baseline data, risk assessments and forecasting that will drive our pre-disaster planning, post-disaster needs assessment. This includes identifying the most vulnerable sectors, people and the critical assets, and to ensure recovery measures that are taken do not place the people, institutions and assets more at risk than they were before. Importantly, it includes risk financing measures from preparedness to recovery and investing in the people to ensure that they are better off than before. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And Mr. Maka?
Malalei again. Resilient recovery in Tonga revolves around enhancing the nation's ability to bounce back from natural disasters. This includes improving disaster preparedness through early warning system and community engagement, constructing robust infrastructure to withstand disasters, diversifying the economy to reduce vulnerability, conserving the environment for long-term sustainability, establishing social safety networks to support vulnerable populations, and fostering international cooperation for shared knowledge and resources in times of crisis. These measures collectively contribute to a more resilient and sustainable recovery for Tonga. Malo.
Thank you, Mr. Maka. Ms. Michelle.
Thank you very much. For us, resilient recovery means that communities learn and strengthen from their recovery experiences. Predominantly, we are really seeking that they better understand their risks and prepare for the disruption that may be caused for, particularly in Australia, a multitude of different disasters. That infrastructure and defence systems are built back to better withstand future hazards, and importantly, that communities build their social capital and local leadership. The role of our government and the various governments that support recovery is really to be there to support communities to do these things. It's our role to be ready and to really meet these communities and governments where they are at. To invest in our recovery funding in risk reduction and greater preparedness to ensure that there is greater self-efficacy for those that may be impacted. And certainly our learnings tell us that we can foster those recovery of businesses and industry to restore local jobs and economic activity, supporting the development opportunities that can arise from these recovery activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Ms. Vasiti.
Thank you. I guess the definitions are the same across all sector, but if I was to put into one sentence, because it's only 1 minute, it's Fiji's ability to return to normalcy after a disaster, having minimal impact in social, environment, and economical sector.
Thank you, Ms. Vasiti. Mr. Daniel?
We look at resilient recovery as efforts to bounce back and continue on the normal life activities, as well as building adaptation capacity.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel. So I think in terms of its definition, in terms of the key ingredients for resilient recovery is similar to what our colleagues said in the first session. And I think it's very clear when it comes to resilient recovery, bouncing back, communities, engagement, and so on. These are priorities. These are the key ingredients. Now, coming to to understand what works and what does not. And in your experience from your country, if you can tell us, based on what you have learned from your last disaster recovery experience, what measures or policies have you adopted or plan to implement to better prepare for recovery? What is needed in order to support countries and local governments with adopting these measures? So if you can tell us from your experience, maybe I turn to first to Mr. Mafua from Tonga.
Mahalo Abito. Following the Hunga Tonga Hunga Hawaii undersea volcanic eruption and tsunami, our disaster recovery measures focused on improving tsunami forecasting, strengthening telecommunication infrastructure, building infrastructure with volcanic risks in mind, implementing effective risk communication policies, and promoting community awareness and preparedness. To support countries and local governments in adopting these measures, we have engaged in knowledge sharing through best practices and technical assistance, fostered international cooperation for resource sharing, advocate for financial aid, pushed for global standards in disaster recovery through policy advocacy, and facilitated the transfer of advanced technologies to enhance disaster preparedness and recovery capabilities globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maka. So maybe turning to Melissa, it's the same question, Melissa, based on your experience, what measures or policies have you adopted to plan, implement, better prepare for recovery?
Thank you. And I may just provide a little bit of context on our last recent event to situate you in my response. So I come from Western Australia, which is more than 2.5 million square kilometres. It's about the size of Western Europe, or 7 times the size of Japan, with a population of just 2.9 million people. So whilst our population is relatively small, our recovery is challenged by distance, isolation, and obviously dispersed communities. We had a flood in January 2023 that exceeded all recorded and oral histories, inundating 11 communities and an area of 9,600 square kilometres. The floods occurred in one of the most remote areas of Western Australia, and it's further than 2,000 kilometres from our capital city, being Perth. The floods destroyed a significant piece of infrastructure, the Fitzroy Bridge, and it severed the only all-weather highway in a regional area larger than Japan and isolating towns and communities from the rest of the state. So to come to your question, the learnings that we took from this event was really that this recovery was distinguished by the strength and influence of grassroots leadership. We had 5 local Indigenous groups that were determined to work together and act as a unified voice on behalf of their people. In the conversations from the session yesterday, I think what struck me was when these communities do self-organise, how can we lean into that and actually support the journey that they were willing to go on? It's fair to say that this group has successfully provided frank and fearless advice to government, and they to this day hold us to account to the activities and the journey that they are willing to go on. We are incorporating these scalable models in the governance structures, so adapting our current policy and legislation to ensure that those community voices can be heard in future events. I just also wanted to comment on the fact of the long-term nature. We have just passed 12 months as an anniversary, and whilst we have managed to build back the bridge and also house people in temporary accommodation that was co-designed with those groups that I discussed, we also recognise that there is economic development opportunities, and they were a priority outcome for not only government, both at a Commonwealth and state level, but also for the community itself. The employment targets were embedded in all of the reconstruction aspects of this recovery so that locally workforces could be trained and supported and engaged in employment opportunities. More than 25% of the construction hours of the Fitzroy Bridge were attributed to the Indigenous community and their people, and 26 Indigenous-owned businesses were also awarded contracts to undertake the work during this time. As a result of the community feel the ownership of the reconstruction works. I was there only last week, and they have all commented that it is the agencies helping us to rebuild the bridge, not the other way round. We do recognise that we have some work to do across all levels of government to normalise these sorts of outcomes that are achievable. But however, I think as you indicated at the beginning, it is a little bit of going slow to go fast. And in our haste, where we try to rush into these events, stopping and listening to those local community members and engaging them in the governance frameworks to achieve these sorts of outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Now I'll move to Ms. Michelle and Daniel, both, on the same question. So, Michelle, over to you.
Okay, just to set some context, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, over the past 5 years in particular, we have been hit with every hazard possible. Whatever you can think of has happened. We had the COVID-19 pandemic, like all of us had. And just to put our context, we're a small island state, population just about 105,000. And, you know, having one death is too much for us. So we had 128 deaths from the pandemic. We had eruption of the Last Fire volcano in 2021 that displaced 20% of our population. Forget the small population, just imagine 20% of your population being displaced within 24 hours. Increased dengue cases, flash floods and nahas following the eruption. We had Hurricane Elsa in 2021. After eruptions, we had extreme rainfall. Last year, we had 25 consecutive days of the hottest days ever in our record in 2023, and we're constantly plagued by the dry spells. And I want to focus a bit on the volcanic eruption, being the largest national response and recovery efforts that we have had within most recent times. And certainly when we had to do some systemic planning. So we can draw on that. But as we speak in recovery, and our moderator clearly indicated that the planning before an event is really important to assist in your recovery. And in particular, the volcanic eruption in 2021, we would have done tremendous work in the knowledge management, information sharing, and the risk assessment with our population in the northern part of the island, and letting them know why they're at risk, and who is at risk, and the areas that they will have to move. So we did a lot of planning through our regional trade winds exercise with the US Outcome. We did our own internal planning, improving our plans, so that when we actually went into an effusive eruptive phase in 2020, it was easier to work with the population because they already were armed with the information and ready to move. So basically, the continued work with the most vulnerable population does pay off for recovery and for them to understand the reasons why certain decisions are made pre-eruption and post-eruption. As we continue, we had to improve the database of the most vulnerable persons prior to the eruption. We started this before the eruption. We didn't get to continue, but we had to finish it at the end. So our most at-risk community must be mapped, and we were able to use different tools during the eruption, such as the COBA tool to capture the damage assessment and link to the social assessment within the country. One of the measures that we would have implemented before the eruption as part of recovery efforts is that in 2017-2018, we approved a contingency fund, the disaster contingency fund, which was passed in Parliament. And this allowed us to build our capacity and our preparedness and be able to anticipate our recovery and have funding available upfront and not having to wait on any external donors to really deal with our own issues at hand. The first time we actually drew down on this fund was actually not for natural hazard, it was actually for the pandemic. So it was a good thing we had this fund in place and we were able to use it again in following the volcanic eruption. Currently, our Ministry of Finance like to brag that they have about $60 million in reserve, which is good because we don't know when we are going to get that next external shock that is really going to have to propel us into using our financing and put in all our reserves. Our disaster risk financing policy, which we were working on for quite some time, post-eruption, was actually approved last year by our cabinet, and it highlights our approaches for funding recovery. And this is all tied to efficient post-disaster needs assessment and methodology, which must be mainstream across all the sectors, especially in the Ministry of Finance. We have continued our work on the development and social protection policy and strategy to address persons impacted by hazards. What we are seeing over the years, especially in the social assessment part of it, is where when the social assessors actually go out, that persons who have been affected really should have been on their radar long before, but somehow they are not. So the disasters tend to really push through the more vulnerable persons so that they can be captured a little bit more within the national system. And we have to really look at bridging these gaps and having those persons who really are in need of assistance to really be on the radar. And for the first time in our history, we have our ongoing population census, and we're able to convince the statistical department to have some questions actually looking at risk within the census so that we can get that information later on persons who have been impacted by a hazard, where you live, what is your most frequent hazard, so we can use that information later on to do some risk assessment and mapping.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Now I go to Daniel.
The major disaster risk in Nigeria is flooding. In 2022, there was serious flooding in our country, very unprecedented. About 656 deaths were recorded. 4 million Nigerians were affected. 2 million Nigerians were displaced. Hundreds of thousands of houses destroyed, farmlands destroyed, means of livelihood disrupted. So with this scenario, our country has adopted the measure of emphasizing on forecasting. There are 2 institutions in Nigeria that are statutorily assigned to do forecasting. One is Nigerian Meteorological Agency that handles seasonal climate prediction to give information on the rainfall pattern, what will be the adverse effects of rainfall in certain areas affecting economic activities. Then another institution is Nigerian Hydrological Services Agency that produces what we call annual flood outlook that contains areas that will be affected by high probable flood, moderate probable flood, and low moderate flood. So with this information, communities will know their flood pattern, and with this information, Nigerian National Emergency Management Agency, which is the establishment statutorily saddled with the disaster management in the country, the Director General of NEMA, the Director General of Nigerian Meteorological Services Agency, and the Director General of National Hydrological Services Agency, the 3 institutions in 2023 came together and carried out what we call downscaling of early warning alerts for early actions and compliance. That really helped, because when we look at the statistics of 2022 flooding in terms of impact and effects, and the statistics of 2023 flooding, although the severity in 2023 was not as high as that of 2022, but there are significant reduction in the level of destruction and damages. About 80 to 85% reduction has been recorded as a result of the vigorous early warning driving to the communities. And the state governments, that the subnational governments, have keyed into this early warning sensitization. And that helped a lot in mitigating flood impact of that of 2023. And we also engage in risk communication through print and electronic media, using local and indigenous information dissemination to get these messages to the grassroots. So it was very helpful to Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daniel. I think we heard a lot of keywords here in terms of the long-term nature of the recovery planning, the ensuring grassroots leadership and engagement, and planning before the event, and most importantly, I think pre-planning for funding and financing recovery. Now, moving on, I think diving a little deeper into when it comes to recovery preparedness. So I'm moving to my second question, which is a little bit of a deep dive into the recovery preparedness. What really works for you in your country? So in your country's experience, what you have learned, what works with recovery preparedness, what measures or policies have been particularly effective with supporting resilient recovery and building back better, and why? If you can focus on this question, maybe let me move to Ms. Basiti first.
Thank you, Moderator. It's good to hear the level of discussions that are happening on recovery preparedness. In the term that we are so used to, in my office, it's called disaster preparedness. It's interesting, disaster preparedness, recovery preparedness. I guess at the end of the day, it's still preparedness. And for us, it's really about the different disasters that are now happening. And as I speak right now, Fiji is currently under flood warning, and there's massive flood happening right now in Fiji. And what we are now seeing is, even with our early warning system in place, it is not, places that have never been flooded before are now being flooded. We are now saying that, this is an implications of climate change. We are witnessing that every day, because we are seeing that the level of investment and development that used to happen before, it now is hampered, because this is what we are now witnessing. Places that has never flooded before are now flooding. And right now, as I speak, reports that are coming in, some of these places are very unprecedented. Bridges are going underwater right now in Fiji. As we speak, communities are now being evacuated to evacuation center as we speak. And last night, they reported landslides to some of the homes. So this is the reality that we face for us. And for, I speak for my office, Mafua could probably speak for that as well. For us in the Pacific, or in this case, my office, we handle everything from disaster preparedness to disaster rehabilitation. And as rightfully said by our colleague from Nigeria, almost every time you're reaching the end tape from disaster response, there's another disaster. So you switch gear back to disaster response. Or in this case, when we had TC Winston in 2011, Category 5 TC Winston, just when we were moving into rehabilitation, we got hit by another Category 2 cyclone. But because it had a lot of heavy rain, the impact on infrastructure was much higher than a Category 5 cyclone. So right now, as we speak, the level of disaster, you just don't know the predictions anymore. Signs are there to tell us, it will guide us, but I need to emphasize the importance of risk. Resilient development needs to be now embedded as part of development. In Fiji, it's something very new. We are introducing it in our rural community, risk-resilient development. We're trying to improve their water catchment, water tank to ensure that it doesn't blown away with strong winds. But really, it needs to be there needs to be a political will. It really needs to be implemented from the top, because for us, we're witnessing the deterioration and the loss of our lands every day. And what we're also seeing is our traditional knowledge is also being affected. We're so used to, when I grew up, there's a saying that says, when you have a lot of breadfruit fruiting in one branch, that's an indication there's a disaster coming. Now, even we have lots of breadfruit fruiting in one branch, disaster come and it doesn't come, but the impact that will happen on the ground is still as equal as any other disaster. So disasters, the impact on the ground is different. So we can have cyclone, we can have flooding, we can have landslide. All this have a different way of responding. And so in Fiji, we do so well in cyclone because there's a slow onset to it. We can predict, we can forecast, we can do impact-based forecast, that's easy. What's not easy for us to predict is flooding and landslide. Why? Because our baseline data still needs to be improved. We don't have LiDAR data for Fiji, and without that, we cannot go down to centimeter accuracy when we want to pinpoint certain houses that needs to be moved because of flooding or because of landslides. And these are all attributing towards disaster preparedness. Also, just a quick one, I also wanted to say that, there's a lot of work done by local government. So our partners, it's a matter of aligning yourself to what's already there. Again, for TC Winston, we did an early recovery plan for Fiji, and I did share it with Dave that our early recovery plan in the office is is time-bound to only 6 months because our priority is livelihood. So everything that we plan across all government is limited to 6 months to ensure that we are able to bring life back to normalcy for those that are affected. And then after that 6 months, we work towards rehabilitation. But again, as alluded by my colleague from Nigeria, by the time we are building disaster rehabilitation, the other side of my team are planning for disaster response. And that's the reality that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Basiti. Mr. Mafua.
Thank you. I think Basiti covered a lot of areas that I was about to also reflect on. It's the same as we are from the Pacific and we are looking at our land size and the size of our populations. We seem to have the same. But anyway, let me add on by looking at the context of Tonga. In the effective recovery preparedness involves implementing early warning systems and community engagement. Constructing resilient infrastructure is the most important thing nowadays. Establishing social safety nets and ensuring government coordination, fostering international cooperation, promoting climate resilient agriculture, and leveraging the technology and innovation. So these measures collectively contribute to minimizing the impact of disaster, supporting resilient recovery, and build back better. It's crucial to tailor these strategies to the specific challenges and needs of Tonga, considering the country's vulnerability to natural hazards and its economic and social context. Malo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mafua. And now let me ask Mr. Daniel.
In recovery preparedness, in Nigeria, we regard disaster management within the multidisciplinary approach, multi-stakeholding, that everybody should be involved in disaster management in the country. And with that understanding, what we call Humanitarian Coordination Forum has been established. These will look at the response to address the humanitarian crisis during disasters. There is also what we call National Disaster Risk Reduction Management System that will look at the causes, also reflects back on the experiences of the previous years to design measures that will enable effective correction of what happened previously. So this stakeholding measure has helped Nigeria seriously because everybody will be involved. Many ministries, departments, and agencies that their functions relate to disaster risk management will be brought together. So that has been of help to us. And also the strengthening and existence of disaster data risk systems. In NEMA, we have our situation room that collects data across the country. We have GIS lab that help in analysis of spatial data. Mm-hmm. And in addition to this, there is an institution called National Bureau of Statistics that have data on various socioeconomic sectors. Then there is National Space Development Agency that undertakes aerial survey and remote sensing for this data to be deployed in flood recovery preparedness. So this data is available and these measures are there. Recently, the United Nations Development Program under Sahel Resilient Project have put in place measures to establish disaster database hub in NEMA, so that all these data that exist in silos in different ministries will be centralized to enable risk-informed decisions, risk-informed planning, risk-informed development, and investment for recovery in the preparedness sector. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daniel. I think we heard a lot from our colleagues in terms of what they have been doing, their experiences, and we also heard about still, some of the challenges, such as the nature of risk is becoming more and more complex. When it comes to recovery planning, some countries are facing moving from one disaster to another very frequently. As we're saying, due to perhaps climate change, the intensity, the magnitude of some of these climate-related hazards are more frequent. It also puts the challenge with countries in terms of what time they have for planning. When you are, the same national emergency management agencies are responding to disasters after disaster, there's a very, very little time perhaps to reflect and plan adequately. And on top of that, we heard challenges on data silos, not enough sharing of data, and so on. So with that, I think let's look at some of what could be possible solutions we can come up with, or what is your sort of direction or suggestion in terms of what can be done better. And towards that, my question to our dear panelists are, what recovery preparedness measure do you recommend and can be or should be widely scaled up and adopted? What is needed in order to support countries and local governments with adopting these measures? And what do you see the role of IRP and the international partners in making this happen? So if you can reflect on solutions or suggestions, recommendations to move forward, and how do you see IRP and other international partners can play a role? So on this question, let me first go to Ms. Melissa.
Thank you. And I do feel like I'm going to probably harness some of my colleagues' comments as well, because I think whilst Australia has quite a mature framework, it's still not without its challenges, noting the changes in the climate that we're all experiencing. So I'm going to start with data, because I think, echoing my colleagues here, we are quite lucky in that we're quite data rich, but it's not necessarily organised and able to be accessed at the time in which we need it most. So that may be at the beginning of this process where we are looking at disaster risk reduction and preparedness activities. And nor is that data or information sort of available in formats that is easily digestible. So it tends to be geared towards our government partners and stakeholders, not necessarily in ways and forms that community members themselves, who we request form part of our shared responsibility mantra, actually can engage and actually participate in. So there is a lot of work to be done. In Western Australia, our government has funded a model where we're creating a digital twin of our state, and that is informing all different databases, similar to what Nigeria was explaining, around having those available data sets. Through that use of technology, we hope that through preparedness processes, we will be able to run risk scenarios through that, capitalising on the extent of that information, and also not only using it at a state or Commonwealth government level, but also sharing that with communities at their local disaster planning workshops and frameworks, so that they can use some real-time experiences without having to go through this. I think the having to go through this is another really critical point, and that goes to not only our workforce that works in recovery, but also to those communities that are impacted on an ongoing basis. And our colleague from Malawi, who expressed it as, sort of getting hit and having to stand up and getting hit and having to stand up. I've been involved in 3 major recovery efforts over the course of the last 3 years. And the first thing I notice when I walk into a community, particularly around the 6-month mark, is around that point where they are actually just so fatigued that we're really struggling to sort of get back up and continue on that journey. I know COVID accelerated some of that fatigue in our communities, but also in our workforces. We too, like Fiji, are an agency and an organisation that does end-to-end emergency management, and I just feel like you're passing that baton more constantly and consistently around that table. Some of the things that we're trying to do in terms of our workforce is broaden the remit from the traditional emergency management disaster risk reduction agencies and look more broadly into our broader public sector network, frameworks. We implemented a program called Switch during COVID, which enables us to take expertise from various agencies and place them into teams or task forces that may be responding or preparing and dealing particularly with very complex policy challenges that we're being faced with currently. So I just reiterate that certainly I feel like it's quite universal in terms of what we're all contending with. However, two examples that I thought I would share regarding the data aspect and also our workforce management and some of the things that we're trying to, get a grip on so that we can continue to support these communities in times of need.
Thank you very much, Melissa. So Michelle, what do you recommend?
Okay, quite a few things, and my colleague from Nigeria would have mentioned the whole issue of the risk assessment and the risk-informed decisions that we need to be making that involves our physical planning department, our GIS mapping, our modeling for resilient infrastructure, because you're seeing almost every other year, 1 in a 100-year flood event that forces you to redesign your infrastructure. So we need to look at that whole risk assessment. Disaster legislation is key to include the handling of relief efforts, how do you rebuild going forward, the declaration of unsafe areas. Many times we see that we have repeated disasters every 40, 50 years, the same communities and the same population along the same riverbanks. You have to go back and do recovery measures again. If you would have legislated that many years ago, it would avoid that repetitiveness. The disaster risk financing must be anticipatory and not waiting months and years after impact for recovery program to roll out. And we talk about the fatigue on our communities. After a year, 2 years, you cannot get back into your community and home. The people are really kind of losing hope in the system and in the persons who are actually managing these relief efforts. It's key for us to build our social protection and our safety nets, and this must include our psychosocial support for our affected population. We don't often hear it in recovery. At the end of the day, every house that we see destroyed, every community that is flattened, there were lives, there were persons living in those homes, extended families, and we must focus on people-focused and people-centered. We also have to look at the adhering to our building codes to ensure resilient infrastructure. One of the things that we do in St. Vincent, our government does housing programs following emergencies, and you must adhere to the building code so that the next event you will not have those kind of losses. What is needed to support and the role of the IRP, I think we look at to push the recovery planning and recovery frameworks. We don't see it often. Only after we have been impacted, you hear about recovery and recovery planning frameworks. And if you do your assessment, you will see that most countries who have been impacted by a major hazard in the last 5, 10, 15 years, they did not have a recovery plan or recovery framework to really drive the recovery process. You tend to think of, recovery agencies being developed post-impact. And then, of course, they have the same mandate that you may have with the National Disaster Office, and then you have a bit of conflicts coming there. We need to work with our regional institutions, whichever region we're in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we have SIDEMA, who have current resilience pathways, initiatives. We work with the World Bank and other partners. And, of course, with our international partners, look for the capacity building to conduct assessments such as the PDNAs. We have to depend too many times on our external agencies to come into the country and do these for us. And I want to reiterate the call for single databases across sectors to capture this kind of information, the risk information, and also all those persons who have been impacted by the various hazards. So we can have one database, reduce the repetitiveness of the assistance given to persons, and have everything under one umbrella. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Now let me turn to Ms. Vasiti, and if you can tell us your recommendations as well as what would you suggest for IRP and the international partners.
Thank you, Moderator. I guess the term that comes into my mind, which aligns to what I said earlier, is localization. I share the same sentiment with regards to data, with database. Our Act allows us to pull data from any organization if need be. The problem is how useful is that information at that point in time, and how outdated is that information at that point in time. So again, looking at policies, reviewing existing SOPs to ensure that the change of environment and the impacts of climate change, the risk-informed development are now embedded into the different policies and SOPs and in place. And the reason I said localization is because some of these organizations in Fiji, the respective lead agency in emergency services know exactly where the gaps are. And so partners, at times, and I've seen it myself, the gaps are there, the reports are there, but then they bring something totally different from a whole different place, and they bring it across to say, or think, this will work for Fiji. It's never going to work that way. First, you lose our ability to own that piece of work after you're finished, and secondly, the sustainability of that piece of work. So please, if there's any word I would like to reemphasize is localization. Work with the gap that exists within country so that by the time the lead agency leaves, that particular work is sensitized. And I'd like to acknowledge one of the projects that we're currently doing with JICA on mainstreaming disaster risk reduction. So one of the divisions in Fiji, so Fiji is divided up into 4. One of the divisions right now, we are mainstreaming disaster risk reduction. We are looking at different floods, different rivers, and we're trying to implement strategies where we hope that development partners can actually look into and risk-informed development. So we hope that this is going to mainstream. JICA moves, once we've finished one of the economical division, NDMO, through mainstreaming this work and JICA sitting in office, we will then roll it out for the remaining 3 divisions in which the office itself runs the project to mainstream it right across. So that's just an example of capacity building in-house, aligning it back to localization. And the key word is sustainability and ownership. If government does not take ownership of the new initiative you bring across to the country, it will not work. As simple as that, it will not work. You go, the project goes back with you, and it will be collected as a dust file somewhere. When you probably come back 10 years' time, you can collect it and relook what has happened. So please, localization is the key term. And I think I just want to probably wrap it up. I think part of the question is some of the ways that the international partners can support this. Capacity building and training, I gave the example of JICA. And also, I think there's a need for us to also, flexibility in terms of financial mechanism. Less loan, more grant, especially for disasters that are now incurring more than ever before into our region that was not caused by us. I was at Dubai last year campaigning for loss and damage. Thankfully, is now a component which UNDRR will now be the secretariat. And that equals disaster management very much dominant in that space. It has to be UNDRR, right? So that for us is a platform for us to raise the fact that the disasters that are happening in our region is not incurred, it's not caused by us. It's caused by developed partners who are incurring a lot of this development. And we are reaping the effects of it. We need to be accounted for that as well. So those are just a few things I would like to share.
Thank you very much, Vasiti. I think it's very practical suggestions, and I'm sure the IRP partners and steering committee members are taking a note of your plea and will implement eventually. Now, quickly, if Mr. Mafua and Daniel, if you have any reflection or any recommendations.
I strongly believe that recovery preparedness measures that should be widely scaled up include comprehensive risk assessment, the early warning systems, community engagement, resilient infrastructure, strengthened healthcare and emergency services, social safety nets, climate change adaptation. But I think to support the adoptions, capacity building, as Vasiti mentioned, the financial assistance, the technology transfer, and policy advocacy are crucial. International organizations like the International Recovery Platform, the IRP, can coordinate efforts, mobilization resources, facilitate knowledge sharing, and provide capacity development to ensure effective implementation at the national and local levels. Collaboration and support from international partners are essential for building resilience and mitigating the impacts of disaster. Malo.
Thank you very much. Daniel.
My suggestions are that countries should design and implement structural and non-structural measures to facilitate the disaster recovery. And these should be driven by policies, plans, and frameworks. In Nigeria, we have National Disaster Risk Management Policy 2019, National Disaster Recovery Strategy and Framework 2014, National Infrastructural Resuscitation Plan, National Climate Change Act, because we realize that the flood in Nigeria is as a result of the climate change. So there is National Climate Change Act. It is an act of the Parliament that came into force in 2021. National Contingency Plan and National Response Plan. This plan will help to drive the structural and non-structural measures. Disaster management institutions should engage political leaders to understand the importance of recovery activities as part of developmental effort, so that the political leaders will mobilize funds for special interventions and normal interventions. In Nigeria, during 2022 flood, Mr. President approved the sum of about 101 billion naira for NEMA to carry out special intervention. And in addition to that, another component of money was approved to some ministries like Ministry of Works, Ministry of Water Resources, and Ministry of Agriculture to repair their facilities that were destroyed by that 2022 flood. So if this engagement and enlightenment is carried to the political leaders, I think there will be political will to devote some monies for disaster recovery. And we also adopt inclusive decision-making, planning, and project implementation. We are doing this within the context of leaving no one behind, so that everybody will be part of it, and this will elicit buy-in, ownership, and sustainability of these projects. Then on the part of the IRF, my suggestion is that the IRF should formulate generic recovery measures that countries can adapt and refine to meet their national realities and national priorities. And IRF should also engage donor countries, agencies, development partners on the need to mobilize funds to assist developing, underdeveloped countries, as well as small island states. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daniel. So with those excellent interventions and recommendations from the session, I think it's time for a little more interaction from the audience. So I open the floor for any questions from the audience from here first, and then I will go into the screen from audience online. So, Yuichi-san.
Thank you, Sujit. My name is Yuichi Ono from Tohoku University. It's great to hear the experiences from each country. And my question is related to the problem of why the Build Back Better through recovery preparedness is slow or not implemented, as you said, Sujit. And my question is whether some of the countries have acts, laws, and regulations which allows the Build Back Better in the recovery process. So if you have any experience, example, it will be good. And maybe IRP, it would be good to compile such examples as to promote which country is doing what would be great. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuichi-san. I'll take 2-3 more questions, and then I'll turn it to panelists. Do you have any more hands? Yes. We have Rita, and then a colleague from in the front.
Thank you. Similar to the question he asked, I think I was very keen to hear if countries are focusing on developing sector recovery guides on what it means to build back better in specific sectors. I think that's critical to establish from before what standards you want them to reconstruct to after a disaster. So do we have those guides, and what is the scope for building that, and what role of IRP and partners like UNDP can be in there? We made a start in a couple of countries. It's not very far yet, not gone very far, but I think for us, that's the way to go. For each ministry, each line ministry to establish standards about what they think should be, what they understand as Build Back Better, when you're taking an all hazards approach and not simply just for floods or just for cyclone. It's a little bit more complex of course, but still, I just wanted to get the views from the table on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Yes.
Thanks very much for all the panelists. My question is, I think it has been raised also about the issues related to environmental degradation and its role also in accentuating these disasters, but also in terms of the recovery itself and the environmental impacts of the recovery. In terms, of course, when we're going to have the recovery, that means more depletion and extraction of natural resources. And I would be interested to learn more about how the environmental dimensions are being incorporated in recovery planning and frameworks, as well as any thoughts about how nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches to enhance the integrity of the environment and its resilience in mitigating disaster impacts, how that is featured in your plans or strategies and frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you. Let now turn to the panelists to address any of these questions. One was why it is slow, and if we can compile, which is I think a question to IRP Secretariat, is that if we can compile country experiences. I'm sure there must be effort in IRP in the past to do so, and perhaps this can be done again. Then there was about do we have guides and standards and guidelines with the all hazards approach, and how environmental dimensions are incorporated in recovery planning. So any of the panelists would like to take this question and reflect? Daniel,
let me start with the first one, whether countries have policies or frameworks on Build Back Better specifically. What is happening in Nigeria is that the Build Back Better is designed to meet national priorities. For instance, when I was talking about non-structural measures that involve provision of livelihood materials and food items, this is to address poverty in the country and hunger. Nigerian government has what we call National Nutrition Policy. So with the distribution of food items, it goes a long way to enhance the nutrition level of Nigerians. So the recovery activity in respect of non-structural is arranged to meet these national priorities and national interests. Then on the issue of the structural components is for developmental purposes that government is willing to provide some level of funding, and the DG NEMA was invited to address the the Nigerian Governors Forum. That is the state governors, another level of government in Nigeria. What all the governors there were talking about was on structural measures. So governors have keyed into the structural measures, although there is no defined policy for building back better. But when they have accepted this, it otherwise translates to build back better in recovery preparedness. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Vasiti?
Thank you for the question. Well, I still have the mic. I'll try and answer all three questions, just so that when I'm finished, you don't have to ask me any more questions. So why is BBB slow? If I take the example, because it's quite general, but if I specifically look at the shelter cluster, To Fiji, through after-action review from recent disasters, we've noted that the shelter class, or in this case homes, are one of the worst affected sectors in Fiji. They're the ones to go down. What we're now seeing is most of them are going down in the rural areas. Now, that led to the negotiations on the now revised Fiji Building Code, which is in its final stage. One of the key outcomes of that revision of Fiji's building code is the affordability of the standard. That's something I'd like to raise in the forum as well. We are wanting to place a standard that no new home should be built to Category 5 standard. And we all know when we build to Category 5, that comes with additional cost. And so when the consultations went around, the very people who are affected are the ones who objected to it because they can't afford it. And so the building code for Fiji is currently now being divided up into two. Those that needs loan from the bank, you'll have to meet the standard, and there's a separate guideline for rural communities to meet a certain standard to still qualify. So those are some of the interventions that we try and do to still address the gaps that exist at the community level. With regards to the standards as well as the multi-hazard, very, very difficult. At the moment, we don't have a concept where we have all hazards in. Fiji is currently in the next week, we're having a whole of government consultations on developing a multi-hazard early warning system. And I tell you, even from government perspective, trying to bring in another government agency who leads the warning agency for that particular hazard is not easy. It's not easy. It's not calling up. You sit on the table and then they will tell you everything under the moon why they can't come and contribute to that particular push that you're now trying to do. Okay, so the importance of sensitization and also upskilling our very own people to understand that the way things are moving, we need to move towards multi-hazard early warning system. So Fiji is fortunate that come next week, we'll have a whole of government stakeholder meeting. We are trying to bring this under one umbrella. And we are looking at 5 different agencies who are science. And when you talk to scientists, it's difficult to explain to them ordinary language when they know that they are backed up with science. So this is a challenge that we'll have. And when we meet next year, I'll tell you if that meeting next week is going to be a success or not. Environmental degradation, the impact of environment towards our response plan. Depends on the hazard. So if it's a landslide, we'll definitely send our geologist on the ground to determine the stability on the ground, and that builds our response plan. You raised the valid point. It really should be across all hazard. But at the moment in Fiji, because we grew up with cyclone, we know how to handle cyclone, but we're now seeing that sphere is also changing, and the need for us to actually involve more of our environmentalists into the discussion table. For nature-based solution, we do have river nature-based solutions. But what's now interesting, and some of the outcomes that are coming back to us now, is some of our river nature-based solutions are now failing. So we are now trying to see whether it's the impact of climate change or what is causing this failure. And this is a study that will forever continue to evolve because of the nature of where our country is. And as I said earlier, we are the receiving end of climate change. We get disasters all year round. And if scientists are true, if IPCC is true, if we go beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, we are at a point of no return. That is happening right now in Fiji. And we are now seeing it with some of our nature-based solutions investments. So just wanted to share that.
Thanks, Vincent, for that very comprehensive answer. I hope that really answers most of the questions. And with the kind permission of the panelists, if I may move on to some questions online, because I have online audience who are also asking questions on Webox. Since we have another 5 minutes to go, I would straight jump into these questions online. So I have 2 very specific questions here. One is, would a pre-disaster recovery readiness assessment be of any help to help you or other countries in aptly managing future disasters? And if so, what should be the must-have ingredients of such an assessment? That's question number 1. And the second question is, if you have participated in the pre-disaster recovery planning workshop yesterday, what was your experience and how do you see it benefiting your ministry if conducted at national level? So I think these are very specific questions. If I can now turn to our panelists, if you would like to address some of these.
Thank you. The uncertainty surrounding international assistance following a disaster has put pressure on countries to establish domestic sources of finance for post-disaster relief, such as national reserve and instruments that transfer risk to the international insurance market. What I'm trying to say here, the word they use, the extended arrangements that have been made by Tonga include an emergency fund, a contingency budget, and a sovereign catastrophe risk insurance. And I'll give you one example, is that the Hunga Tonga Hunga Hapai disaster. So Tonga's government announced a recovery and resilient building plan for the Hunga Tonga Hunga Hapai disaster. That calls for 240 million in recovery needs, and the focus is on 4 priority sectors: the housing recovery, food security and livelihoods, tourism industry, and public infrastructure. What I'm trying to say here is that if you try to recall my presentation yesterday, I outlined the Tonga Resilient Pathway Building Back Better, and I mentioned like the Tonga Disaster Risk Financing Strategy, the Joint National Action Plan on Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management, and Tonga Housing Recovery and Resilient Policy. What I'm trying to say here is that we all have the legal framework. We have all those things in place. But the question is that, looking at the question that was put forward to us, is that how? How are we going to implement these policies? Looking at the size, as I mentioned, the geographic setting of a smaller country like us, and how we react whenever there is an emergency. Right. Looking in a way, I'm going to bring in one example from my experience in the island, a remote island. When we discuss about the resilient infrastructure, I always refer to resilient infrastructure. For the main island, resilient infrastructure, putting a wharf there is looking at the wharf, the infrastructure wharf. But for island, to put a wharf in the island, the definition of resilient infrastructure won't apply to the island. Mm-hmm. So they prefer a floating jetty. So whenever there's a cyclone, they can pull out the jetty and put it there. There will be no jetty. So I'm trying to say here is that despite the fact that we all have all these things in place, community engagement to implement whatever plan in place is the most important issues that I always emphasize. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So any reflection from any panelists on these questions, which is on pre-disaster recovery readiness assessment and pre-disaster recovery planning workshops at national level?
I can give it a go. The pre-disaster assessment, I think it's good if we can do that before to really identify the gaps that you have in your national system and across sectors, because we had a question on sectoral resilience earlier. And I think sometimes we do not focus a lot on the sectors. So the pre-disaster assessments and the risk assessments will really give us a good in-depth country perspective of what the gaps are in country. And I think it's really important, especially across the sectors, especially across the agriculture sector in particular, because food security is going to be a major issue with the continued changing climate that we're really not addressing a lot when it comes to hazards. And we are seeing with the different extreme temperatures across the region, especially in 2023 in the Caribbean, we are seeing the food deficit and the livelihoods being impacted of the farmers. So I think the gaps will really set the pace and set the context and tone for what is in country and what we need to improve on.
Thank you very much. So, yes, Daniel, maybe
on the pre-disaster recovery assessment in Nigeria. Before we will go into recovery activities, we handled or we conduct what is known as PDN post-disaster need assessments. We also handled damage and loss assessments to determine the needs and the level of destruction that could be addressed during recovery. Also last year, World Bank assisted Nigerian governments to conduct what is called GREAT assessment. It was a rapid assessment, so it was facilitated by World Bank. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think the time is up for me in this session. Very quick summary. I think I won't be able to really summarize the richness of this discussion, but just a couple of things I noted down which could be some points for IRP and the international partners which I was trying to take notes are essentially the requirement of having capacity for recovery frameworks at national level, capacity for doing PDNAs, and enhancing data integration at the national level, contextualizing to the country's local or localization in the context of country. I think this came out, and in-house capacity building. So I think we are hearing a lot of needs for capacity building in different areas. Recovery preparedness to be scaled up, and local capacity building is needed. Policy-driven recovery, reconstruction, and rehabilitation. Enabling funding and financing in recovery, which is essentially that the enabling countries to do appropriate planning and also access to funding and financing. I think there was a mention of development of generic guidelines and standards for countries to adopt, which is an ask, I understand, from the IRP members. And last but not the least, pre-disaster recovery assessments and planning workshops at country level, if that's something feasible. With that, I'm already, I think, 2 minutes over our session time. I would really sincerely like to thank all the panelists for their time and the really excellent discussion in this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.